Blue Origin launched NG-3, the massive booster touchdown on the recovery deck, and the webcast immediately declared a victory. Then the FAA stepped in and pulled the keys. The public relations line talked about an off-nominal orbit, but the regulator opened a mishap investigation centered directly on the upper stage propulsion. How does a polished rollout turn into a federal grounding before the applause even finishes? We are going to look at the telemetry mismatch, the trajectory reconstruction, and exactly what the data showed the moment that BE-3U engine tried to push for orbit. Watch this, because this is where the public narrative and the engineering reality separate. AST SpaceMobile confirmed their BlueBird 7 satellite ended up in a lower-than-planned orbit and will be deorbited. That is not a minor navigation nudge, that is mission loss. So the company frames the flight with the phrase off-nominal, the customer says the payload is dead weight, and the FAA triggers a formal mishap process. You see the spread right there. Off-nominal is a status term that finance-led management uses to smooth over a rough afternoon, but mishap is a regulatory condition that grounds your rocket. Those are not interchangeable concepts. Once the FAA makes that call, the accountability machine starts moving. They notified NASA, the National Transportation Safety Board, and the U.S. Space Force. That level of classification does not happen for a routine hiccup. It happens when you need to document what failed, trace the timeline, and prove what broke before anyone signs off on another launch license. According to Blue Origin's own CEO, early data pointed to one BE-3U engine on the second GS2 burn not delivering the thrust needed to hit the target orbit. That is a clean-sourced admission from their own side. But the gap between admitting a thrust shortfall on a webcast and clearing a mishap investigation is exactly where launch programs stall. Customers buy performance and insertion accuracy, and if the vehicle is the limiting factor, they go elsewhere. The market does not buy the narrative. It looks at the numbers. The slide rule guys always warned about the upper stage. That is where orbital missions are made or lost. The first stage gets you moving out of the atmosphere, but the second burn on GS2 is your critical energy addition after separation and the initial coast. Restart conditions are different in a vacuum, tanks are lighter, pressurization behavior changes, and thermal states shift. You build massive margin here because there is no safety net, and if you miss the box, you lose the payload. The Apollo Gen had this pegged decades ago, and they knew you never celebrate until the orbit closes. Now check the mechanics of the investigation. The FAA does not care about the booster landing highlight reel. Under the mishap process, they care whether the commanded thrust lines up with the actual output. According to reporting summarized by Sat News, the agency is zeroing in on second stage thrust, burn duration, the delta V deficit, and whether the vehicle held attitude during that critical GS2 burn. That checklist goes straight at propulsion, guidance, and trajectory closure. If one BE-3U engine did not produce enough thrust, you are talking about a hardware shortfall, a burn profile deviation, or a control issue that kept the engine from reaching expected output. The investigators will look at chamber pressure traces, turbopump speeds, and valve positions. Chamber pressure is king. If pressure is low, thrust is low, so the burn duration has to stretch to make up the missing delta V. If the burn duration does not stretch, you miss velocity. Pressure, flow, and time are the three levers. If any of those come in weak, the trajectory reconstruction will expose it, and the U.S. Space Force sensors already saw the low insertion. You cannot spin orbital mechanics, and this is the bit the FAA will lock down. If the investigation concludes that a single engine glitch caused the miss, you swap the hardware, fix the performance margins, and refly. But if the telemetry shows the stage couldn't hold attitude, or if the thrust dropped because of propellant delivery and sequencing, you are looking at a system problem. Guidance, navigation, and control issues take much longer to untangle. That hits the schedule, and that drains confidence. Stay with me, because the timing of the anomaly is what regulators always circle in red. The public story leans on insufficient thrust from one engine, which sounds clean and contained. But the FAA is going to look at exactly when that underperformance showed up in the data stream. If the anomaly was detected early in the burn and not compensated for, that points directly at guidance logic. If it showed late and the system just ran out of time, you are looking at margins. And if chamber pressure sagged across multiple components, you are looking at the feed system or tank pressurization. Different fixes mean different timelines. If internal post-flight data says the mission was unrecoverable before payload separation, but the external messaging stayed upbeat, that discrepancy is what gets you audited. According to the register's coverage, the FAA asks for a full burn reconstruction to compare what the software asked for against what the hardware actually delivered. Telemetry tells the truth. You can massage a press release to keep the investors happy, but you cannot negotiate with a burn profile. This process has layers most people never see. United States Space Force certification sits right on top of the FAA review. That is a different bar. National security payloads demand higher scrutiny, and you don't get that certification with a question mark hanging over your upper stage performance. So now the program has two tracks running simultaneously. The FAA is saying prove the rocket is safe, while the Space Force is saying prove the rocket is reliable. Different words, but the exact same demand for proof. Now look at the external pressures building up. Every delay hits credibility, and every anomaly gets compared directly to competitors. While the investigation drags on, customers want schedules and insurers want confidence. You don't just risk losing one mission when a vehicle gets grounded, you risk losing the next ones. That is how the consequences stack up, and here is where it gets sharper. Attitude control during the burn is a massive variable. If the vehicle wasn't pointed correctly, you lose efficiency fast. That bleeds delta V because you waste energy constantly correcting the vector, and you can't close the orbit even if the engine itself is healthy. That shows up in the trajectory reconstruction. If Blue Origin claimed the flight was nominal through separation, but the trajectory had already diverged, that is a mismatch. That is core to the investigation. Then there is the escalation beyond just the flight data. The reporting also flagged a facility anomaly, specifically the two-cat roof issue. That widens the entire scope. Regulators aren't just looking at flight performance, they are looking at the processing flow and the test conditions. Was something compromised upstream before the vehicle even reached the pad? Post-flight anomaly reports, engine health logs, and the mission timeline all have to agree. If they contradict each other, you have a compliance problem. This is where the hangar talk gets loud among the veterans. The legacy aerospace culture leaned heavily into process and presentation, where slides say nominal with green boxes. The Apollo generation didn't do green boxes. They did numbers and tight margins, and they lived on the test stand. When a modern program gets boxed into admitting a propulsion shortfall after a highly produced rollout, you feel the deep difference between post-merger management culture and old shop floor logic. The engineers were right to push for margins on the second burn, and told you so on a national scale. While Blue Origin sits grounded, waiting on corrective action approvals, the competitive gap widens. SpaceX runs a fly-fix-fly model where they build, test, accept failure, and iterate fast. FAA launch logs show the cadence difference clearly. Falcon keeps flying, upper stages keep hitting insertion, and reuse stacks up weekly. Cadence builds reliability, and no other rocket has stacked that many clean insertions in that time frame according to FAA logs. When you are grounded, your cadence goes to zero. You sit, you write technical reports, you run simulations, and you wait. The market does not wait. Here's the part nobody talks about regarding the FAA's 3 oversight gates. You have to prove the root cause failure is understood, show the corrective fix works, and demonstrate the fix does not create a new hazard. The agency's requirement is brutal because anything tied to the failure must be shown not to threaten public safety. That means flight data, engineering analysis, and verified hardware fixes. According to Tech Times, a clean booster landing does not offset a second stage shortfall. The agency focuses narrowly on the upper stage even if the first stage was flawless. If the second stage issue ties to core engine performance, you face deep validation work. Hot fire testing, model updates, and flight margin reassessments consume amounts of time. 14 years into development, and the program is still fighting upper stage closure. That is the exact kind of pressure that slips manifests and makes defense contracts nervous. The investigation runs on a clock the company does not control. The FAA will take ground-based radar and optical tracking, fuse it with the onboard telemetry, and rebuild the entire burn. They check propellant mass flow against the expected delta-V. Every data sample gets reviewed, and when they finish, the story either closes or it doesn't. If the internal logs don't match the public narrative, Blue Origin has to revise the final report the FAA signs off on. They have to eat it publicly because that report becomes the official record. We hit the midpoint shift where the boardroom meets the engine bay. Management called it a partial success, but down on the floor, the engineers were staring at a thrust shortfall and a delta-V deficit. Two different languages, but the FAA only speaks one of them. Return to flight depends entirely on data the agency accepts, not confident statements the company makes. The cost-plus crowd used to get hammered for this exact behavior, smoothing over anomalies to keep the funding secure. Now fixed-price players face the same scrutiny because physics does not care about your contracting model. When a rocket misses orbit, nobody trusts the press release. They pull the streams. Raw telemetry, launch logs, and post-flight reports always tell the real story. This isn't just about engineering anymore, this is about trust. If the company knew the mission was failing earlier than they admitted publicly, that is a direct hit to their credibility. If the internal logs show early degradation, that is a reporting problem. And if the crafted narrative softened a hard engine failure, that is exactly what gets you called into a hearing. The old-school engineering mindset says you find the root cause, tear it down, and fix it right. Finance-led management wants a fast answer and a clear path back to the launch schedule. Those two priorities do not always line up, and this is where programs fracture. The Apollo Gen didn't rush this process. They dug through the telemetry until the answer held up against the physics. Blueprint guys didn't sign off on maybe, they signed off on data. So let's lock the facts. One BE-3U engine underperformed on the critical second burn, leaving AST SpaceMobile's payload in a useless orbit. The FAA grounded the vehicle immediately after the anomaly and opened a formal mishap investigation focused on thrust, burn timing, and trajectory. And return to flight requires a fully approved report with proven corrective actions. The next FAA license update is expected to hinge entirely on this propulsion reconstruction. When that final root cause document drops, does it confirm a simple contained hardware glitch? Or does it expose a broader system integration issue that the vehicle didn't know how to handle? The telemetry is going to decide who has to eat it.